Welcome everyone to In the Struggle, a conversation on industrial agribusiness, politics, and activist scholarship. We're very happy to have you joining us this evening. My name is Kristen Reynolds. I'm the chair of the Food Studies program here at the New School. And I want to begin by thanking Mike Harrington, who's the assistant director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center, who has also been instrumental in making this event possible. The event is presented by the Food Studies program and sponsored by the Tishman Center. I wanted to give a bit of information about our Food Studies program here at the New School. It's situated in what is known as the Bachelor's Program for Adults and Transfer Students in the Schools of Public Engagement, a division at the New School. The program has BA and BS degrees with concentrations in 3 areas: culture, media, and communications, health and the environment, and policy and politics. We also have an AAS degree, and we accept credits from certain culinary institutions. Some of our classes are available to the public through our university's open campus program. And we have a number of events like today's event, often sponsored by different programs throughout the university. So a few words of welcome and housekeeping. The event is being recorded. Please keep your mics off so that we can focus on the speakers that are presenting their insights. We will have the Q&A segment after the speakers are finished, and we ask you to put your questions in the Q&A, in the chat, and we will be receiving them on our end, and we'll read aloud the questions for the speakers to respond to. So we will begin with an introduction to the series and this evening's event, followed by an overview of the book by Dan O'Connell and Scott Peters, the authors, followed by then a panel discussion with Krista Nunez and Onika Abraham, and concluding the speaking portion with the legislators' responses, New York State Assemblywoman Donna Lupardo and New York State Senator Michelle Hinchey. Then we'll move on to the Q&A and conclude with a call to action. So I'd like to read a brief introduction to the Food and Public series of which this event is part. For some who are less familiar with the field of food studies and food systems, the word may conjure mainly images of the material food that we eat. This is, of course, an important aspect of the food system, as well as studying, researching, and working to make it more sustainable and equitable. For example, working to increase food access and food security under climate change and rising inequality. But food studies and food systems step beyond the materiality of food itself. They include and attend to rural and urban agriculture, the food supply chain, labor and workers' rights, and cultural foodways, to name a few. Many of us may have heard or thought about food as a way to bring people together around the dinner table, for example. Dr. Kyle Powles-White at the University of Michigan is among many Indigenous scholars who have written about the understanding of food not only as a way to foster relationship, but that food is itself a relationship between peoples and the earth. As he states, quote, depending on the peoples, food actually refers to different conceptions of collective self-determination, end quote. These points underscore the fact that while food and its consumption can be personal or individual, it is at once social and often public. Studying food can be about the food we eat, but it is also often about systems thinking, the public sector, and community. And so this series centers these ideas. Tonight's event, about which you're about to hear much more, focuses on strategies that scholars, community-based organizations, farmers, and state legislators have and are using to create a more equitable and just and sustainable food system in the public realm. Tonight's event holds special meaning for me because my own work as a scholar has been marked by several of those whose stories are recounted in Dan and Scott's book. I did my graduate work at the University of California, Davis in the early and mid 2000s. Along with several of my peers, I was fortunate to learn from scholars both within and outside of the academy who were using the tools of research to understand societal phenomena and support positive food and agricultural systems change. Among these mentors were Dr. Desmond Jolly, and 2 of those included in Dan and Scott's book, Dr. Isao Fujimoto and Dr. Dean McCannell, who, along with his partner, Dr. Juliet Flowers McCannell, are in the audience this evening. Their mentorship was foundational to my own work and that of countless former students, many of whom have gone on to become leaders in academia and community-based food systems change. Dan and Scott's book, about which we're about to hear more, has ensured that their stories will be accessible to many more. So a final thing I want to highlight about the evening's program is about the spectrum of working for incremental and systems change in the food system. As elsewhere in the United States, here in New York City and state, there are important political and economic efforts underway to address the at times challenging realities faced by small-scale farmers, including the price of land rents and the need to hold one or more off-farm jobs to make a modest living. There are also policy advocacy efforts to recognize and address the additional challenges that small-scale farmers of color have historically faced and continue to face, which often stem from institutional or structural forms of racism. At the same time, there are many community-based organizations, many of them led by Black, Indigenous, or people of color, working to create systems change, recognizing longstanding racial and economic inequities in agriculture and food systems, for example, in farmland ownership or access to healthy and culturally relevant foods, and reimagining a food system in which BIPOC groups and diverse ways of knowing are central to urban and rural economies and food systems. And so all of these efforts, among others, exemplify the fact that in diverse sectors, there's much happening in New York, upstate and downstate, to create a more just and sustainable food system. And there are many research institutes and scholars, and many ways that research institutes and scholars can support these initiatives through our community engaged teaching and our research. So we'll hear more about this shortly. As I mentioned, this event tonight is a part of our Food and the Public series. Our Spring 2022 series will be called Critical Food Studies and Social Justice. And our first event of the series will take place on February 10th, and will focus on food entrepreneurship, sustainability, and social justice. So we invite you to attend that event, which you can hear more about by emailing us or looking at the events.newschool.edu website. And so without further ado, I will introduce our first speakers. Dr. Daniel O'Connell is Executive Director of the Central Valley Partnership, a regional nonprofit organization and progressive network of labor unions, environmental organizations, and community groups spanning the San Joaquin Valley. Trained as a multidisciplinary ethnographer, he holds an MS in International Agricultural Development from the University of California, Davis, and a PhD in education from Cornell University. As a politically engaged scholar, his work is dedicated to achieving social, racial, environmental, and economic justice in California. Dr. Scott Peters is a professor in the Department of Global Development at Cornell University and a historian of American higher education's public purposes and work. He has spent the past 20 years as a leader in the civic engagement movement in higher education, most recently serving as the faculty co-director of Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life. He's the lead author of Democracy in Higher Education, Traditions and Stories of Civic Engagement. He's also co-editor of Cornell University Press book series, Publicly Engaged Scholars, Identities, Purposes, and Practices. And of course, Dan and Scott are the authors of the book In the Struggle, about which we will now hear. So I will pass the mic to Dan and Scott.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's an honor to be here with you, and we admire you and your work very much. This is a conversation we're eager to learn from and to participate in. And so thank you for offering the invitation. I want to begin with just a few words of background about the book before handing it off to Dan. And I'll begin with something that Isao Fujimoto teaches. Kristen mentioned Isao as one of her mentors at UC Davis. Isao is one of the major persons in our book. Isao said, "It is said that if we're going to make any sense of what we are doing, we have to know what story we are in. If we're going to make any sense of what we are doing, we have to know what story we are in." In the Struggle is a book about a story is centered in California, but is really about geographies across the whole world. So I want to just say a few things about it. First, there are three interconnected themes that play out through this book. The first is an analysis and critique of industrial agribusiness. What the book does is it delineates a geography, a critical topography across history as it describes the construction and maintenance of unjust and oppressive structures in the Central Valley of California. Second, the book is a tutorial and guidebook on how to resist and fight back. So the book doesn't just talk about the oppressive structures and how they played out over 100+ years of history. The book actually centers on the work of organizers and scholars who have participated in organizing. Through their stories, the tactics, organizing tactics, research methods, engagement practices, strategies that they've used that have been effective in fighting back against industrial agribusiness and the corruption that has come with it, but also not just in fighting back, but in actually pursuing creative and positive ideals. And finally, the book is an expression and embodiment of democratic values and the importance of community. So these three interconnected themes play out through 8 scholars, through their own first-person storytelling. Only 4 of these 8 scholars were employed by colleges and universities as academic professionals. The work of producing knowledge and theory happens all through society. It doesn't just happen by people who are engaged, who have jobs as professors. Helps us to see that. So the story that Esau teaches us, we need to learn to see that we are in, that you'll see in this book, as I mentioned, is not just about California. The dynamics of industrial agribusiness, the organizing and struggle of those who have fought against it and those who have fought to pursue positive ends linked to their core values is something that has played out in the United States in every geography, and that has played out and is playing out in many places in the planet right now. The story that the book documents also is not finished. This is not a backward-looking book. This is a book that picks up on a story that is in fact growing in power. Finally, I want to say that we wrote this book, and the book functions as a call to action. And I take this personally as a professor at Cornell University. The book makes us ask the question of what we should do. Each of us will have a different way of answering that question based on where we sit, what our position is. As a professor at Cornell University, I think there are 2 things that I feel I need to do. The first is to actively listen and learn, to find the leaders who are out there on the front edges of work, on the leading edges of work, to learn from them, to listen to them, to offer a possibility of relationship, to see if we can build that relationship. And through those relationships, to see if there are ways that my own institution, Cornell University, and its resources, including our students, might be able to support the work that is underway. To not just, again, fight back against something, but to build something that matches our values and vision. I will say that this is a big shift for institutions like Cornell to be in a listening and learning mode. We tend to be in the professing mode, to think we have things to tell and to share. But I think the demands of this struggle that has arced over 100 years, and of course, many, many centuries before that, puts people in institutions like Cornell University, needs to put people in institutions like that in a listening mode. So I will hand it off to Dan now.
I'd first of all just like to start out by saying how nice it is to see Dean and Juliet McCannell join us tonight. So good to see both of you. This event realizes our hopes for the book, except, you know, when we were at Cornell about a few months ago, we always wanted to have the book launch be in conversation with community organizing. We had an event at Cornell, but we also had it at Chris's farm. And so, you know, this bridging, and now today with Donna and the legislators, is it even more another step forward. The book is an analysis of structured racialized oppression within the context of California. but it can be applied to other contexts. I think that New York actually is a geography more conducive to a democratic scale of rural life and agriculture. And when I was at Krista's farm, I was amazed at what's happening there and really optimistic. And I'm optimistic about what's happening in California as well. The book, though, is not only a critique of monopoly and economic concentration within agriculture, as we're describing with industrial scale agribusiness. It's looking forward, just like Scott has mentioned. I wanted to mention a few aspects of this forwardness that the book is going at. The book integrally links economics and politics. The key finding of the book, drawing off of Goldschmidt's initial study and Dean's follow-up, and then all the organizing and the values of Taylor and Galarza, the educational outreach and pedagogical practices of Avila Rejo or Fujimoto and Janaki Jagannath. I try to synopsize that into economic equity is a necessary condition and a measurable outcome if you're going to have a democracy. So basically the book is saying, if you're going to have a democracy, it's measured in homelessness, in hunger, in all of those measures that Dean and Walter Goldschmidt studied. We can look at those and advocate for them and create them. And the more we achieve economic equity, the closer we come to economic and a vibrant social life. And finally, a few just takeaways that I'm working on now and that I hope is going to be taking hold in New York. The book is integrally connected to land. The call for land reform. Currently, I'm thinking of creating community land trusts here in California. Not only is it naming a problem, it's suggesting agroecology and other frames to mobilize around. It's deeply vested in multiracial organizing and intergenerational engagement. So just to hand it off now, I wanted to return to Esau's quote. If we're going to make any sense of what we're doing in the world, we have to know what story we're in. The book is an invitation for each of us to continue our stories and to get in the fight and to co-author a story that I'm optimistic about the organizing, the multiracial organizing that's occurring in California, and I suggest in New York. I think the book also has a lot to say for places like the Midwestern United States, which was once such a progressive era and now so reactionary. I'll leave it at that. Overjoyed to be joining with all of you from New York and to hear about how the book is connecting with the mobilization efforts that are happening now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan and Scott. It's wonderful to have this overview of the book as grounding for the following discussion. So I will now introduce our two panelists. Krista Nunez is the founder and director of CAN Cooperative Media, the Learning Farm, and its nonprofit sister organization, Cuba International. Krista possesses 12 years of experience in nature and garden-based equity-focused education. For the past 3 years, she's operated a summer camp at the Learning Farm, as well as an after-school and outdoor program during the school year. Through Cuba International, Krista has implemented community and school garden programs in rural California for food insecure communities, supported garden and forest-based education for an orphanage in Haiti. Her work centers around equity, particularly for BIPOC youth and families. Through both her for-profit and nonprofit organizations, as well as with community organizations such as the Finger Lakes Land Access Reparations and Reconciliation Working Group, Krista prioritizes increasing equitable access to food, land, and nature for youth and families. Onika Abraham is Executive Director of Farm School NYC. She's a parent, a partner, a farmer, and an educator with more than 15 years of experience as a senior nonprofit manager and an MBA in marketing and entrepreneurship from the City University of New York's Zicklin School of Business. After leaving her position as Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Safe Horizon in 2010, she spent the next 5 years with her hands in the soil, learning as much as possible about growing sustainably, including at the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens Brooklyn Urban Gardener Certification Program, and then the Farm and Garden Apprenticeship in Ecological Horticulture at the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She became the Farm School NYC director in 2014, and she is also one of the co-founders of Black Urban Growers. Her commitment to this work continues in her efforts to recruit Farm School NYC students that reflect the diversity of New York City, especially from those from low resource and socially disadvantaged communities, and help them achieve their professional farming goals. So we've asked Krista and Onika to give some thought to a few questions we have, and I believe that they're going to speak about them together. I apologize if you can hear these sirens that are characteristic of my being in the center of New York City right now. So the questions that we've asked them to consider are, if you could open with a brief description of your work, and then tell us a bit about the key issues that you've addressed and what types of advocacy or activist initiatives those have entailed, including any collaborations that you might have had with academic researchers and scholars in support of your work. And then finally, what do you see as the most pressing or salient issues to address in our food system from your vantage point? That's a lot, but thankfully you've had some time to think about it before the moment. So I'll pass it to the both of you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Onika, how do you feel about going first? What's your preference?
I'm happy to do either. I wish I could see us side by side on the screen, but I don't know how to make it happen in Zoom world, so be it. But maybe we can take the first question of just sort of, talking about our work in a more general sense. Sure, you asked me to go first and I'm happy to. So I think I always start when I think about the work and how I came into it, really thinking about the organizing framework that I was born into as a native New Yorker and New York City person. I was born and raised on the Lower East Side of New York City. Oh, there we are. And in New York City, if you know anything about the Lower East Side of New York City, one of the many things you might learn is our deep, deep history of community gardens and community-led agriculture in New York City. And growing up on the Lower East Side, I was surrounded by lots of different people of color, Black and brown folks who were reclaiming land, reclaiming lots, and using them as a means to build community and to grow food and to preserve culture and to educate families. There was just so many dynamite things that were happening in those gardens when I was growing up, and I think that became a part of me. And so when the opportunity came to be more involved and to follow some of the steps of my ancestors, because I come from farmers, to get into and be supportive of urban agriculture, I really jumped at the chance. So Farm School NYC is an adult education program based in New York City, really focused on the communities that I come from. So lower income communities, communities of color, Black and brown communities, and looking at ways that folks who want to use farming as a means and a mechanism to build food sovereignty and social sovereignty within their own communities, to really build and shift power in their communities. And so we do that in a variety of different ways, including courses. So there's 20 different courses that we do throughout the year. Everything from like laying drip tape to looking at systemic inequalities and what kind of creates that on a policy level in our communities. And so that's a big part of the work that we do at Farm School NYC. I do want to talk about some of the work that we're starting to do together, Krista. But I thought maybe before getting into that, I pass it back to you to talk more about your organizations.
Thanks so much, Onika. That's beautiful. I love that you remember where you came from. That is so beautiful and so meaningful. I think that quote by Isao Fujimoto that's been quoted a couple times this evening already, the last part of which is we have to know what story we're in, and remembering who we are is so core to the work that I'm doing, and helping folks make those connections. I want to show a picture on page 133 of the book that we're discussing this evening. We have the honor of having Juliet and Dean McCannell here, and this is a picture of them. And it says that they're with Isao Fujimoto at a demonstration in support of the establishment of African American Studies at Cornell University, and this is in April 1969. And I wanted to pull that out because I went to University of Michigan, and I always credit my African American Studies class at that university as my big awakening as a scholar. And I think that it was the first time I was introduced to myself and my people back when I was 18. And although I'd been raised by very activist, very community-oriented parents, having the space and time to really study who I am and my people, my history was, and having all the time I needed to do the research and sit in front of microfiche machines and be in libraries. That's what I want for more of our folks. And I think the work that I'm doing with people of color in Ithaca and in Tompkins County really does center around creating new stories, new ways of being, new ways of collaborating together, new ways of visioning what our food story could be, what our land story could be, through making connections to our history of who we really are. So my project, Quarter Acre for the People, is a new project that we were just wandering some land in Danby on Saturday, and just seeing the hope and the vision in people's eyes as we eat bagels and wander the forest and get our feet wet and ford streams together was, that's a new story in the making. I try to think, okay, we're just wandering some woods with a realtor and talking about what space we could use for growing things. But that's a new story. And I think that all of these things are coalescing in really meaningful ways, and Quarter Acre for the People is just a program that is an expression of this new story that we're developing together.
I think that's so beautiful because, as you say, it's a new story. I'm like, that's an age-old story too, right? Because it relates so much to like the ways that I wandered rural Alabama with my farming grandparents, and the ways that they would show me that the ways that they were learning the land. So it's also a return, which is a really beautiful thing. And so much of what people, I think, assume around, and I'm, going to make an assumption that some of the folks identified as Black in that group, maybe, that you are wandering with. And I think folks often assume that we don't have that kind of deep connection to the land because they rightfully see that many Black, in New York State in particular, we are a very, very urban population. For the vast majority of Black folks in New York State live in New York City or the surrounding areas, like 93% maybe. So we are not necessarily that rural, but there's a big draw to that. And that's a big part of our story, that connection to land. And I see so much of that kind of return coming back. And I think that's a big reason why so many people come to places like Farm School NYC, and how children are drawn to your programs as well, is because we're recognizing that return.
Yeah. I read a startling stat the other day that New York State is more so than Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, the main culprit of a separation of people of color from green spaces and farm spaces. I think it was like 9% of African Americans live in green spaces in New York State, and 73% of European American people live in green spaces in New York State. And so it was the state with the biggest gap of land access in green spaces and sort of environmental stressors. So I was surprised to see, I always think of New York State as being this big progressive kind of place, but more so than many states that we sort of shake a finger at with regard to inequity. we're not doing so great. So it's great that you're doing what you're doing, and especially with regard to urban spaces and affording people of color in those spaces opportunities to get their fingers in the soil. So thank you.
I think that's a good segue. I'm not sure, I'm getting a little bit choppy, so that might be my Wi-Fi. I'm sorry if it is. But I feel like this is a good opportunity to talk about some of the work, how I met you, which is through the work of Black Farmers United. And so I can talk a little bit about the history of the organization and how that came together. And I would love to know how your way into that work that we've been doing together. So from my perspective, Black Farmers United really started as a reaction, as a reaction to some startling statistics that came out. So the Census of Agriculture for 2017 came out in 2019. I guess it takes a while for them to get all that data together, right? So in 2019, we received a report of the Census of Agriculture, and it was astounding. I think that many of us were really, really surprised at how few Black farmers actually filled out that survey. And we saw that there were 149 Black farmers in all of New York State, which is 0.24% of all farmers in New York State. And that's how, I think we were just all shocked, the people doing this work, because I feel like I know 100 Black farmers just from walking around New York City. So there's a lot in that statistics that is frightful, and a lot in that statistic that is not new. So the two things that, a lot of things stand out in that, but that's just one number. The actual representation is lacking, right? Black people are 17% of the population of the state, 0.24% of the farmers in the state. When you're looking at the amount of money that Black farmers actually make in New York State, I think the average farmer in New York State, regardless of race, the average amount of income they make is $42,000, which, okay, right there, we should just stop and have a conversation about how undervalued that labor really is, right? But then if we kind of layer race into that, the net income of Black farmers in New York State is negative $900. So these disparities are really, really stark. And I think seeing it on a little 2-pager, from the Census of Agriculture really made it apparent to all of the organizers that I was in community with, the farmers that I was in community with. And we all started to come together, partially from ways of knowing each other, people who were working together. 20 different farmers from across the state gathered together, sent an email to the Commissioner of Agriculture, Commissioner Ball, and we're like, we need to talk, we need to start working together, we need to figure this out. There was a meeting in October of 2019 on Mama Karen Washington's farm, collective farm with farm partners in Chester, New York, Rise and Root Farm. And then coming out of that meeting between October and December, those farmers who were organizing together came up with 9 initial solutions for disparities in agriculture, building upon things that we knew worked because we were doing them in our different communities in Newburgh and outside of Ithaca and across the state, and looking at the ways that white-led efforts had kind of failed us, and seeing those pitfalls and wanting to avoid them, came up with these 9 solutions. And so we presented them to the commissioner and his staff in December of 2019, and we're really excited because those 9 solutions look at a variety of different interventions, from access to capital, to access to land, to access to education, and not just access, but holding the power for these things within our own community, instead of constantly being looked at as these beneficiary audiences for larger institutions or white-led institutions. We wanted the autonomy and the sovereignty to to create our own solutions. We were already doing it. We were just under-resourced in doing it. And so that was the whole original organizing behind Black Farmers United. Throughout 2020, we came together and did a lot of different interesting interventions. We did hearings, we did a lot of testimony, a lot of meetings, a lot of organizing, a lot of growing, really wanting to get out there and bring more Black farmers in from across the state. There's more to say about that, but I want to pause there and just ask, like, Krista, like, how did you hear about this? How did you come in? What made you want to join this effort?
Oh my gosh, so many different connections. I'm trying to remember exactly. I think it was Martha and the work that we're doing together to support Groundswell's farmer training program. So Groundswell is a local organization that we collaborate extensively with and really push each other to engage more mindfully with folks who are ready to farm and providing that that land access piece, that training piece. And so Martha is on the board of Groundswell, and in connecting with her and doing interviews and pushing the program and really getting out there into areas that, you know, that normally wouldn't receive the call, that there's this programming and this a paid apprenticeship and a lot of different support system. So her and I really pushing that program to get into other areas. She was talking to me about BFU, and it's been great. I'm a new member, and I'm really excited, and I'm happy to be serving on the retreat committee and developing a plan to get our minds around where we're headed. It's just an honor to be able to serve with you and work in that group. Where do you feel, I know there's a big meeting coming up with regard to connecting the dots with the local governing officials. Where do you think we're heading, and what are some of the asks that are going to be on the table with that? You don't mind me sharing?
Oh, no, not at all. Thank you for asking. And just so everyone knows, Martha Williams is the membership coordinator, the only staff person for Black Farmers United, and is dynamite. We've tripled our membership since Martha joined. You see her work in action here with Krista joining up. So yeah, Krista, you've seen the flurry of emails. So in September, I think we sent a letter to Governor Hochul, and just introducing ourselves, introducing our solutions, because the truth of the matter is, we rolled out these 9 solutions in December of 2019, more or less pretty much the same as they are on our website right now. We really knew that these were powerful solutions, and we asked for action on them from the Commissioner of Agriculture, and we're excited because our former Governor Cuomo, right after that meeting in the State of the State address in January of 2020, recognized, you know, that diversity in agriculture was an issue and made a statement in that regard. And we had asked for like action. We were like, you can do these things. You can give $10 million to the Black Farmer Fund. You can give over 1,000 acres to Northeast Farmers of Color Network. And what we got in response was a work group on diversity in agriculture. And it's like, oh, okay, we've done a lot of this work already. And if you read, many of us served on that work group that the commissioner put together. They released a report earlier this year, and you'll see our solutions are in there. Like they're still there. So right now we're really hoping to get some action around those solutions. And roughly, you know, I can talk through some of them, but roughly, I think they really coalesce around 3 main buckets of interventions. One is capital, access to capital for Black farmers, access to land, and access to education, I think are the main areas that we're looking at. And we indeed got a response from Governor Hochul's office, and our meeting was just today, as a matter of fact, Krista. We met with them at 1 o'clock. some members of Black Farmers United. It was, we shall see what happens. I don't know, I'm not sure how that's gonna shake out at the end. It's still early conversations, but we definitely asked for them to implement some of the 9 solutions that we are really clear on, in terms of the funds for Black Farmers Fund, the land for Northeast Farmers of Color land trust, to put land into trust for access for Black and Brown farmers in the state, and for their commitment and their energy and staffing to helping us really build solid platforms around each of the other 8 solutions that are outlined in that document. And we asked for a little bit of money for Black Farmers United because it's a small organization and we want Martha to be on full time, just capacity, building the capacity of the organization we're part of.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Onika. I know that we are on time constraints, so I'll move on to our next question, if that's okay. Would you discuss any collaborations you've had with academic researchers or scholars in support of your justice and equity work? I guess I can go first on that one. Somebody is here present who's been very meaningful to my work here. Scott Peters, one of the authors of the book, has been truly instrumental in helping our organization connect with Cornell and Cornell University resources in support of community endeavors such as Puerto Rico for the People, and also has been supportive of my matriculating as a PhD candidate at Cornell. I'll be starting in the fall. And so, his work, the more I talk to students and staff at Cornell, the more they've uplifted Scott as a shining example of what it means to be a community engaged scholar. And I think his commitment to people who not only are attempting to expand our knowledge base and be able to have time to study our actions and really dive deep in researching the efficacy of what we're doing on the ground, but also just supporting community players in having enough funds to do what needs to be done in our region. So I just want to uplift Scott here as well. And our connection that we just recently made with Dan O'Connell here, one of the authors too. It was amazing having you here at the farm and hearing you speak and hearing your passion for farming and really truth telling with regard to, just the systemic wrongs of big ag in California. It's been really meaningful as well. And so I hope to be able to connect with you more at a national level as well. And I'll turn it over to Onika.
Yes, one of my favorite academics is also here in this format with us, and that's Kristin Reynolds. Kristin has done so much work here in New York City around urban ag and just urban expressions of food sovereignty, whether they're ag-based or not, but mostly around ag. And I think that her studies and her books of looking at different ways of addressing this issue have been really instrumental, and have lifted up some of my favorite farmers, and including some founders of the organization that I feel so honored to steward and run now, Farm School Nyc, and also have been a beneficiary of the Yale lab that Kristin runs. So we've had numbers of different groups of students come and tackle some issues, research issues for us that have been really helpful in different projects and different grants. Currently, we just had a great presentation around the commons, and one of the things we're really trying to think through is at least one of the key struggles that I have in this particular project that Yale students helped illuminate for us was, how do we both hold land and other resources in commons in ways that kind of move us away from the extractive kind of capitalist ways of treating different goods that we're so used to and have been so so extractive and so oppressive to Black people. How do we move away from those formats, hold land and assets in commons, yet still be able to build intergenerational wealth and create that kind of generational reparations that we need in Black communities to help make up these disparities we're talking about? Like, those two things sometimes often feel to me like they are at odds. And it was helpful to have some students' perspective and research around that which no one at Farm School has the time to do. So it's very helpful to have folks doing that on our behalf. So we've had several partnerships like that with Kristen and some other scholars as well. So that's been great. Krista, I think another part of that question was like, okay, well, collaboration. Okay, so I read something in that question, which was like, are there any ways in which you might want to work with scholars that you haven't? I feel like you're on the road to becoming a scholar. So maybe you can do a lot more about that in your own choices. But yeah, any advice or?
I think there just needs to be more community practitioners in the university system. I think that could be extremely transformative. And that would be if I were in charge of admissions or some such thing, or I would just advise deans to really be think outside the box. And I think there's people here who know what I'm talking about and are doing something about it. And so I'll ask what I think is the last question, unless I'm missing something. I know we have about 5 minutes. Onika, what do you think is the most pressing or salient issues to address, whether from an organizing, research, or policy level, to achieve a more equitable agricultural system in New York or nationally? And what is needed to take steps in this direction? So what do you see as the most pressing issues? You spoke a little bit about the work of land access and connecting people with resources and training and business. What are you seeing as most pressing, and what's happening? What do you recommend as next steps?
It's hard. This is a very, all of these issues are interconnected. So it's hard to unravel one and lift it up as the singular thing that will fix it all, right? They're all interconnected. Capital isn't much good if no one's going to sell you land because they don't want a Black farmer next door to you, right? Conversely, if you can't afford that lease, then what good is that, right? If you don't know or feel totally disconnected from elders and mentors that can help you as a farmer, you're going to fail, right? If you don't have the right knowledge. So I feel like those three things are really interconnected. So I feel the need to lift them all up at the same time. And I also want to say, when I say access to capital, I do mean money, that is true. I also mean access to different models that will help us create capital in our communities and different ways where we can build capital within a Black ecosystem. So I think that access to markets is another way of looking at that. Ways that we can build cooperatives or ESOPs or other mechanisms that can hold and build capital that doesn't feel extractive. Ways that we, policies that, help us create preferential purchasing and things like that are really necessary. So I think of capital more broadly. But those are the three kind of pillars in my mind is capital, land, and education. I don't know how to separate the three, but what would you say to that, Krista?
I agree completely. I think for me, it's really getting as many people cooperatively owning, governing land, stewarding land together as a means for farmland preservation, as a means to support future generations on land, people who know how to farm, people who are aware of the systems. Really, the education piece that you mentioned is so important, really getting children into Black farm spaces so that this looks familiar. Like, I ate plums and apples from this beautiful farm, and it happens to be owned by Black people, and that's to be. And I think just as a means to assuage the whole burnout that we're experiencing as farmers is focusing on cooperation, focusing on co-work in these spaces, and really another program that we do is called the Mutu Library, and it's getting a book a month into the hands of young people who don't have enough books in the house. If you look behind Scott Peters, you'll see about 1,000 books. And that's where we're trying to get all the kids to have at least 90 books. That's where literacy begins to take off, is having 90 books in the house. And so a lot of those books that we give out have to do with, why is that happening? Have to do with farming and agriculture and nutrition. And so that's another piece to the puzzle, is educating the youth so that they know what they're doing by the time they become adults and they have a passion in a facility and growing things.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
Thank you both so much for those inspiring and informative comments. I feel compelled to say that our question about working with scholars was not an intention to have you call us out. I think Scott would probably agree with me, but we are very honored to have the opportunity to work with you in our respective ways. And I just wanted to, as we transition into the next segment, think about too how the way that both of you have addressed the tension that I was, or the spectrum that I mentioned earlier in the event, between the importance of working on issues that address the difficulty of farming for all farmers, simultaneously recognizing and working on issues that are more impacting BIPOC farmers, like the number of issues that you just spoke on regarding land access and perhaps familiarity with agriculture as children. And so I just want to highlight that and thank you for bringing that up. Now I will introduce our next speakers, two New York State legislators who we are honored to have joining us, and they will be responding to what they've heard from the panelists. So first, New York State Assembly member Donna Lupardo was elected to represent the Southern Tier's 123rd Assembly District in 2004. She currently chairs the Assembly Committee on Agriculture and serves on the Economic Development, Higher Education, Rules, and Transportations Committees. As a champion for the state's agriculture and food industry, Assemblymember Lupardo has led the effort to address weaknesses in the state's supply chain exposed by the COVID pandemic. She has prioritized small farms and producers, helping new and existing farmers with access to land and emerging markets through programs like Farmland for a New Generation, Cornell's Small Farm Program, and Farm to School. She's committed to raising awareness about the need for diversity and racial equity in our food systems through improved access to resources, training, capital, and farmland. Finally, the Assembly member has worked to expand and develop other sectors of New York's agricultural economy, including the craft beverage and cannabis sectors. She introduced legislation legalizing industrial hemp as an agricultural commodity years before many states realized its potential. So welcome. Next, we have New York State Senator Michelle Hinchey, who is a strong union advocate, a champion on energy, environmental protection, and economic development. She was elected to New York State Senate in 2020, making history as the youngest woman to represent an upstate district in the Democratic Majority Conference. Born and raised in Saugerties, Hinchey brings to the state Senate a perspective on unique challenges facing our upstate communities and is deeply committed to improving the lives to all those who call the 46th Senate District home. Senator Hinchey represents all of Greene and Montgomery counties and parts of Ulster, Schenectady, and Albany counties, which make up one of the most rural districts in the Democratic Conference, with over 1,000 farms that play a vital role in agriculture, environment, and sustaining rural economies. Senator Hinchey serves as the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee. And earlier in her career, she worked as a grassroots organizer for Environment New York, where she successfully campaigned to end the practice of fracking. While working in the private sector, she continued her environmental advocacy as a board member of the Catskill Center for Conservation and Development. She credits her love of public service and community-based activism to her father, the late Hudson Valley Congressman Maurice Hinchey. And so, as for our panelists, we have sent some questions in advance for the two legislators, which I will read now. They're a bit shorter and nonetheless powerful, I hope. First question is, what did you hear today that strikes you as something that can be addressed or pursued through state level policy and state resources? And the second question is, what have you already done or what are you planning to do that connects to inequities and injustices in food systems and to aspirations of equity and justice, particularly for BIPOC people and communities? So I will pass it to you.
I'm happy to go first. First of all, thanks for inviting us. This is really very special for legislators to be part of a conversation like this. I think it's what's necessary for these conversations to have meaning, is to have people from various sectors sharing these ideas. A lot of times legislators are really not part of the conversation. I think we're trying to change that. But what did I hear today? I think probably the one line that's been sticking with me through the whole conversation is, what story are we in? To Scott Peters, Dan, the book is fabulous, of course, and I think there are a lot of extremely valuable lessons to be learned there. But what story are we in terms of New York agriculture? It should come as no surprise that we are in a story of underfunding and underappreciation. And this has gone on for a long time, which winds up supporting the status quo that keeps everyone in the place that they're in, especially on the side of the discussion regarding diversity and racial equity. We're very sensitive to being part of developing the new food story, as was mentioned. And that food story has to involve not only respect for farm work and respect for all the diverse aspects of the food supply chain that have been exposed to COVID, but also the importance of diversity and racial equity. We are very mindful of the work of the task force, of the report that was put out, of the quote that was included in the release of the task force report, which I'm going to remind the commissioner of every time I see him. He said the need for a focused strategy to increase, sustain, and diversify farming and land access across the country is more urgent now than ever, including in New York. We are very committed to making sure that task force report does not wind up on a shelf, that the specific recommendations, which also involve the 9 solutions that Monica talked about, that were very, very compelling, that we wind up putting a plan into action. I think it might be worth just pointing out that in a recent budget hearing that I conducted as part of the assembly side of the equation, preparing for our upcoming budget season, we did have Onika testify. And I have her testimony right here. And she pretty much spelled out everything in her earlier remarks, specifically the need for investment in community-based urban agriculture and business development. But I want to just read one paragraph that really stands out to me, and I'm going to read it over and over again until I make sure that people that we're serving with understand how urgent this is. She writes, quote, "We urge you to not fall into the trap of only financing white-led organizations to, quote, serve farmers of color, which only perpetuates the power imbalances that come with relegating Black people as passive consumers being served, rather than power-building producers that create, grow, and own the means of education and production." Our challenge is, I think I can speak on behalf of my Senate colleague as well, who will speak in a second, we're trying to lift up New York agriculture, all parts of it included. But unless we bring along BIPOC farmers, I think our work will really be hollow and somewhat a shallow victory if we get anything accomplished without this coming up behind it. We've already had conversations with the governor's office. We're very excited about the governor's interest in getting this right for all of New York agriculture and all of New York's farmers, every part of the supply chain included. So what we're doing is trying to move the ball down the field. And what I hear today is a mindfulness of the story that we happen to be in. We need to keep telling people where we are and where we're trying to get to.
Thank you so
Senator?
much. Pass it to Senator Hinchey.
Great, thank you. And I echo thank you so much for having me and for having us today. Krista and Annika, it's so wonderful to hear your stories and your experience. And I thank you for fighting and for taking up this charge and for pushing it forward and for raising your voices with your entire group, because it's incredibly important. And, similarly, we held on the Senate side a hearing on food justice and enhancing diversity in New York agriculture. And Annika also testified at that hearing. And I thank you for spending your time with us then too, because this is just so profoundly important. To share the comments of my colleague, Assemblymember Lupardo, we are working very much to uplift all of agriculture. And what I've been working to, and we've been working to remind our colleagues on, is that New York is set to become the breadbasket of the country once again. Even if we hit the goals of the CLCPA tomorrow, and if every other state and every other country did the same and flipped the switch, we've still done irreparable damage. And when we have in 20 years, it's sad and depressing, but true, when we have in 20 years, Florida still underwater, California still on fire, and the Midwest facing severe droughts, the Northeast and really New York becomes the breadbasket of the country again, as I said. And so we have to really seriously invest in the future of agriculture. And we have a moment right now to really work together to determine what that looks like. And who we are uplifting, who we are elevating, who we are taking along, and how we are reshaping agriculture. We know the average age of a farmer in New York State is anywhere between 55 and 65. We have an opportunity right now to make sure that we preserve our farmland, and we are bringing and again uplifting new and diverse people into this economy, into this sector, quite frankly, who have the heritage in this space for generations. And I think that's something that I heard today that really resonated, and we've been talking about a lot is, agriculture, while the comments that were made of the number of BIPOC people are primarily in urban, what was 97% you said, or 90% in New York City, more urban areas. And so there's kind of the sentiment that maybe agriculture is newer to specifically BIPOC farmers. We know that's not true. And we have to continue to uplift that and also make sure that we're prioritizing the farming of culturally relevant food and how we are prioritizing getting farmland and funds and yes, capital, Annika, into the hands of the BIPOC community who want to pick up this torch and run with farming and agriculture. Some of the challenges that we know broadly for anyone getting into the agricultural space is upfront costs, right? It is a very cost-intensive trade, and cost of land, cost of equipment, labor costs. And for any new farmer, it can be really hard to get the loans you need because you have to prove that you've been a farmer to get a beginning farmer loan. And we know it's even harder for the BIPOC community to get loans anyway. And so, recognizing these hurdles and these challenges up front as we go into our legislative sessions and thinking about them with an eye to, again, who we want to bring along in this space, who we want to uplift, what the face of agriculture should be in this moment of change. Right. And again, I just say thank you to everyone on this call, but especially to the two of you for making your voices so clearly and eloquently heard in this space. And the best we can do is, as I think we've been working to do and will continue to do, is meeting with you and working with you to make sure that we're hitting as many of those possible goals as you have outlined, as you've said numerous times, and one report or another, making sure that we're hitting as many of those as we possibly can.
Thank you very much, Assemblywoman Lupardo and Senator Hinchey. I think you've really pinpointed some of the intersections that are true and are being addressed between intersections of issues pertinent to racial and economic justice in agriculture, upstate and downstate. I wanted to remind the audience that if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will read them aloud for now any of our speakers to respond to. And I'd like to start with one that any of the speakers that are joining us tonight might be able to respond to. And that is, a number of you have touched upon questions of geography or urban, rural, regional differences or similarities. And I'm wondering, again, this question is for anyone, how you have worked with or groups that you've interacted with that are addressing common needs and challenges that are faced by farmers in an urban setting or a rural setting in New York City and state. And I suppose I might add to my question, challenges and initiatives to address those challenges.
There's one organization, American Farmland Trust, that is new to the space of equity, admittedly, and they have mainly been focused on the preservation of farmland as a means to support New York staying and being the breadbasket, as Senator Hinchey just mentioned. But their work I have to lift up because connecting the dots between what we call NOLs, non-operating landowners, with farmers of color, not just as a means to address labor challenges, but as a means to really create inroads for people to access land, to lease land, to own land. I think this is a budding project, and I just want to lift it up with collaborators like myself and others in this region. I think really could have some legs to make movement change in creating inroads for urban folks who've been systemically relegated to urban landscapes to have access to rural land, as we're looking at folks with resources and wealth from cities during a pandemic buying up large tracts of land in Vermont and other places. I think projects like this, giving and leasing large plots of land to people who want to begin to farm larger spaces could be meaningful.
Yeah, Krista, that's such a good point. I think I also want to lift up, Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust is doing similar work in that area, and they have a footprint of the Northeast. And I believe I am hoping that they do more in urban areas as well, as the issue of land tenure is a huge, as well as access is a huge issue. And I think in every urban area, every urban gardener in every city in the state will probably say, I've heard stories from all of them around that. I'd also say that Black Farmer Fund, which I didn't talk that deeply about, but it is a community fund that is specifically offering grants and low to no interest loans to Black farmers and food advocates across, or not advocates, actors across the spectrum, from kind of seed to compost to you name it, restaurants, but really looking to build out this food system. And they do this in urban and rural areas. I think it's really important, and just, thinking about Senator Hinchey talking about access to capital and the real difficult times that Black folks often have accessing loans. Instead of having sort of like the suited bankers sitting there looking down their noses at your financials, what you deal with at Black Farmer Fund is actually a group of other Black farmers, other Black food actors who have come together, have been through a lot of financial diligence training, but then sit and work with you and build relationships with you to help you build out your business plan and strategy and fund your farm-related business. And we're looking at, they've raised so much money privately, so that there's 9 farmers now that have received all at least $50,000 in grants, and also have access to these low interest loans of, I think the cap is like $100,000. And it's a wonderful model that could really use some government input in terms of capital, but that operates in sort of this urban and rural space because access to capital is an issue there for sure across the board.
Thank you. Would any of the other speakers like to address this question?
I guess, I mean, I can just pop in. You know, I think we're always looking for how we can better connect the dots, and especially everything in agriculture, from upstate food into downstate or more urban communities that don't have access to farm fresh food, something that is tremendously important. And one thing that we were able to advocate for and secure in the budget just this past year for the first time, obviously in partnership and spearheaded by Assemblymember Lupardo, was the Cornell Equitable Farms Future Initiative, which is an effort to expand and foster diversity in New York farming and helps farm employees move into management position and financial skills, which is something that we desperately need, right, in terms of looking to diversify the owners of our farms, making sure that we're providing those direct pathways. And so that's something that we were able to do just this past year. And I agree with you, Annika. I think the Black Farmers Fund is an incredibly important organization and is doing incredible work. And it's on us to continue to uplift those kinds of voices and organizations to make sure they can continue to do the work and help even more people in an equitable and really meaningful way.
I have one last thing. I think that for me, it's like a double-edged approach, diverting funds and really beginning to fund organizations like NEFOC, Fair Farm, Black Farmer Fund. Oops. Is that me? No. Okay. Am I coming through okay? All right.
Yes.
I think the two ways I see is really beginning to fund and diverting more funds and as a primary focus to these Black-led organizations, as well as holding white-led organizations that have traditionally been recipients of larger amounts of funds to their equity based approaches. So, AFT, USDA now having an equity commission, those are the organizations that I think hold a lot of resources and should be scrutinized, and the expectation is that they make good on the promises that have been made recently.
If Audre Lorde tells us that the master's tools aren't going to dismantle the master's house, we shouldn't have too much faith in some of these institutions. Yes, if American Farmland Trust turns from their historic constituency, that's great. And they do good work, but I would suggest that we're going to need to innovate off of existing equity and racial justice geared institutions. Community land trusts are equity based, whereas traditional land trusts help existing landowners that are usually pretty well positioned. And we should be doing that as well. But if you took a CLT model And remember, nonprofits can own for-profit businesses as long as they plow those equity back in. And we vertically integrated along the value chain because producing food is very difficult, hard work, but each time it sells, there's a cut that's being taken. If we can copy what a corporation does and own that value chain within a locality, a city, a region, creating a food commons, that will get us much closer. The book tells us that you want capital circulating as many times as possible before it leaves your community. This needs to be structured and planned. Community land trusts or land trusts that own or partner with cooperatives along a value chain to own it for the purposes of equity and racial justice will get us much farther. And those are all existing entities that need to be brought together. I'm really hopeful because of the leadership of people like Donna and Michelle and also the geography of New York, I think is much more conducive to doing this.
Thank you to all of you for addressing that question. I'm always interested in urban and rural connections and as they relate to sustainability and equity. We have a couple questions in the chat, so I'll try to, maybe we can get to at least one of them. So the first is the following, I'll just read it off. What are some of the shifting metrics of success for new entrant farmers pursuing new pathways of sustainable and equitable food and agriculture systems? So what are some of the new metrics of success and how are these metrics being negotiated or set? And the person asking the question says, are they being set by new sources of capital, by philanthropy, or other, by farmers, by supporting communities? So again, what are some of the new metrics of success and how are they being established? If anyone would like to speak to that question.
I prefer the old metrics: hunger, homelessness, the levels of poverty, staying right on the mark of where the naming and the quantifying of the injustices that are happening. I'm sure we can get very nuanced. Too bad Dean can't jump in here. He's so great at identifying different markers of injustice, but the big ones are still there before us in our country.
Thank you for that. I, as a person who runs a nonprofit, I'm constantly asked about metrics. And I always am very curious about the positionality of the person asking the question. But I would say your points are so well taken, Daniel, around the real issues in terms of the inequities that we're experiencing and the ways that our work addresses it. I would also just add, there are metrics that we use within our own communities that mean a lot to us. And so things like our own level of exhaustion versus the self-care and the ways that we want to kind of build. What you said, Krista, about the idea of the collective being able to hold us in this deep, incredibly heavy work of stewarding land, right, is real. So how well are we held? How well does our community hold us? How well does the structure that we've set up on this particular piece of land support our livelihoods, not just financially, but spiritually and in a communal way? I think is a really important metric as well. I think also what's circling for me is what you talked about in terms of the value of a dollar circulating within our communities. That's a huge metric, I think, that especially in the Black organizing I've seen in farming spaces in New York State and in this region is an incredibly important one. So in Black Farmer Fund, for example, full disclosure, I'm on their board. I think that they're dynamite, and I'm never ashamed to say that I'm on their board. I feel like it's an honor. But one of the things that we talk about and one of the metrics that we're looking for, the community of folks that actually bring in and make decisions around funding is How many other Black-led organizations are you lifting up in your work? Are you buying, if you're a restaurant, are you buying from Black farmers? Who's on your staff? Who's in your leadership? Like, we need to understand how we're supporting this ecosystem of Black-led organizations. And we want to invest in those that are also building that up so that we're keeping that dollar circulating in our community instead of constantly extracting, having that being extracted out. So those are two additional metrics I would just lift up to.
I would just like to
I'd
add,
like,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
go ahead, Crystal.
Just adding quickly, questions like who is living where? Are Black folks and urban people? How did that come about? Is that changing? Who's eating what? Who lives in a food desert? Who has access to food? How many Black farmers are there? Is that number increasing, decreasing? I think for us, it's simple. Just like Onika says, I think those are the metrics we're looking at. How many community dinners did I have? You know, looking internally to our organization, like how many people did we serve? How many people visited my farm? How many people have their own farm now as opposed to last year? Those are some of the internal metrics that we look at.
Thank you. I think stepping, go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to briefly say, I like this image of there being a new food story. You know, Krista was talking about that, and it connects to the theme I raised at the beginning. You know, I think it's important to recognize that the 9 solutions that were being put forward by the Black United Farmers represents really important knowledge that is coming from the front edges, the leading edges of the movements and the work that is happening now. For us to, for me personally, as a professor at Cornell University, to recognize that you would not go to Cornell University for that knowledge. That's not where it's going to be. So when we're talking about metrics and things like this in relation to farming, I think this moment that we're in now is that knowledge is being generated in the work, in the leading edges of the work that's happening. The knowledge makers are there. For state legislators, for people like me at universities, we need to recognize that. And I think there's some pretty big implications for that. This connects to the paragraph that Donna read from Onika. You know, it's you can't just keep giving money to Cornell University. Because that's not where the solutions are coming from right now. So I mean, we really need to absorb something, that kind of a truth right now. It has some very significant implications. I don't think it means that all these institutions have nothing to contribute or offer, but it puts us in a place of humility, and it just changes the conversation for us to really recognize that truth. And that is part of the new story. The part of the new story is that people aren't waiting for institutions and professionals and institutions to be creating solutions to hand out to them. These solutions are being created by the folks who are actually building the new system that we need.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to pass it to Dan and Scott for a few concluding comments before I conclude our event. Dan, Scott?
You want me to go first, Scott?
Please.
So the book aims, and the book is hopeful, first of all, and it aims to be useful. In California, we have formidable structures that remain in place, and they're not easily going to be moved. We have a monopoly of land that's sitting on top of a monopoly of water. Enormous components of our life world are now in private hands, and they're just going to not be crowbarred out of there. And so we need to do this work on the periphery as we move into the center. I just have to laugh a little bit that a Cornell professor was just advocating for resources not to come to Cornell, but I do think there's a role for Cornell to do work. It's just even Cornell professors can be a little cynical after witnessing how much is not spent on actually helping our people, and especially a school like Cornell, which is the land grant. But we do need those resources going there. We needed to go in the right place. We have here an issue. The book shows that land, labor, and knowledge itself were organized to create wealth for a handful of people in California. That is a white landed power structure. It's a power structure that's been in control of our country from the beginning. And we need to find ways to engage it. In the book, we witness 4 generations of not only academic engagement, but labor unions, and community organizing, advocacy, and activism. Galarza sets out to overthrow the power structure of California, a rare scholar. I don't think he would have survived long in an institution doing that. But you see how useful he was in collaboration with farm labor organizing in the state of California. I am hopeful. We've made so much progress, and we need to keep stepping forward. And the final thing I'm going to leave you with is I am more hopeful because of the geography of New York and its leadership that's represented both in the community and its elected leaders that are on this call today. Geographies by definition are designed. And in California, we've designed an extraordinarily unequal economy and geography. We're in the midst of trying to transform that with multiracial, intergenerational organizing. But New York, and from what I witnessed on Krista's farm, what I intuitively sense that's happening, what does that back to the land movement look like in New York? And I'm really hopeful. Climate change is coming and New York is very well positioned. California, we're running out of water. They're tapping the Ogallala water for aquifer, but New York is very well positioned for what's coming, and including demographic change. I'll be rooting you all on. The book has a lot of lessons, tap into them. And I'm really hopeful that Scott and I will be soon turning to the Midwest, which I think really needs to hear some of these book talks, but good luck. I'll hand it off to Scott to finish this off.
I'll just conclude by bringing us back to Isao Fujimoto, our friend, our mentor, our colleague. Isao is in hospice right now. I want to bring him up because there's something about him that reminds me of something that needs to be said in this conversation. The title of the chapter of the book about Isao is called War Stories. And that was a phrase that he used. He shared his war stories of battles that he's been involved in. But anybody who has met Isao or known him knows one thing about him that is quite amazing, and that is he laughs all the time. He'll be talking with you about these war stories and these terrible things, and he'll just laugh. And the laugh he has is generous and warm and inviting. I want to bring that up because everything we've been talking about today is an avenue for the most satisfying and important and meaningful work that anybody could want to be part of. Building a food system that is just, that is equitable, that is sustainable in every possible way, making things with our own hands, being connected with people who make things with their own hands, who build things, who create things. There is nothing more meaningful. There is nothing more powerful. In a world with so many jobs that are not satisfying, that don't pay well, and agriculture still, unfortunately, is one of those, has been brought up. We need these avenues for livelihoods and work that's meaningful, that are sources of joy and laughter and satisfaction, even while we're telling war stories, even while we're recounting the battles that we are going to have to continue to fight to build what it is that needs to be built. So the book can feel like a punch. It can get you down to know what's happened in a place like California. But really at the core of the book is a set of people who have joyfully engaged in this really important work. And what we see with Onika and Krista here today, and what I feel is the power of that creativity and that vision and that dedication. It's tough. It comes with toughness. There are tough questions being raised that are difficult and challenging, but it comes as an invitation to join and support probably the most meaningful avenue of work we could be engaged in today.
Thank you so much. I want to conclude our event by, first of all, thanking all of the speakers. Thank you, Krista and Onika, for sharing about your work and the challenges that your communities are facing and how you're addressing this. Thank you to Assemblywoman Lupardo and Senator Hinchey for telling us more about the work that you've been doing to support agricultural economies in our state. Thank you to Dan and Scott for writing this book that I encourage everyone to buy and read. It is so inspiring and informative. As I think Dan or Scott just mentioned, it's indeed can be a punch and can motivate us to action in the way that we might be able to do so through our particular vantage points. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning of the session, we have more events coming up next year in 2022, starting on February 10th with the event on food entrepreneurship, sustainability, and social justice. So you can email us or check our website for more information about that and our upcoming events. Thank you all so very much for attending, for listening to each other, and I wish you all a wonderful afternoon or evening, depending on where you're located. Take care.